Keats was born on 31st October 1795 to Thomas and Frances in Moorgate, London. The eldest son among four siblings, he passed away at the age of 25 due to tuberculosis. Keats had no extensive literary background. He was more known to get himself into fights with his friends. In order to secure financial stability, Keats went on to pursue a career in surgery. It was common knowledge that those pursuing poetry were part of an elite literary circle. The young man's interest in the literary world was first invoked in March 1809. At this point in his family's history, Keats and his siblings had lost both of their parents. In spite of this being a devastating event for the children, as the oldest male, Keats wanted to bring back pride and inspiration to his family. He began switching his focus into academia and utilized his energetic spirit into writing. As Keats commonly explores human suffering, historians would argue that it was during this period that he had first had an insight for the theme. He had written one of the most thoughtful letters to his mourning brothers. Later in the year, he had won first place in a literary competition. Keats's love of literature was further supported by the fact he was a student of Enfield Academy from the age of 8 years old. Here he befriended Charles, the son of Headmaster Clark, who encouraged the young boy to delve into the classics, history, and politics. By 1814, Clark first introduced Keats to Spenser's The Faerie Queene, thus awoken his love for poetry. While observing Keats, Clark reported, "He ran through the scene of that purely poetical romance, like a young horse into a spring meadow." Spenser's work includes a fairy element and use of natural imagery, which Keats himself would be influenced by, as shown in La Belle Sans Merci. She found me roots of Vellish sweet, and honeywild and monadoo, and sure in a strange language she said, "I love thee true." The first couplet highlights the fantasy and sensual concept, provoking a dreamy reading. The later couplet is contradictory and paradoxical in nature, alluding to one of Keats' most famous themes, lover's malady. La Belle Sans Merci is the very first piece of Keats' writing that I've read and certainly a personal favorite. The ballad is memorable because it holds a certain element of nostalgia. The fantasy genre is one which I've been drawn to over the years. It's evident that La Belle Sans Merci implements magical tropes. Rather than being a straightforward fairy tale, the ballad offers a darker narrative and is a prime example of how the most innocent ideas can become sensually provocative. From this 1819 ballad, my own writing style began to develop with grim undertones. La Belle Sans Merci provides a mature insight on how love can be deadly, and this is a motive I'm trying to project. How appearances aren't what they seem, and every supposed passionate bond has its fair share of dark secrets, which is an inevitable aspect of growing up. Keats embodies the traditional idea of poetry. He follows a regular iambic pentameter and utilizes natural imagery to convey his central odes. Themes of romance are often present within Keats's work, as he also focuses on metaphysical aspects. Certain scholars would argue that he pioneered the concept Gothic, as its original form is taking a matter which is religious or sacred, then applying a darker twist to the subject. The poet himself was known to create a lover's malady and/or Keatsian paradox. At its core, this is an inevitable cycle of desire coming to conflict with one's rationality. Lover's malady explores the anguish of falling in love, how the end result can only be pain, and pain itself is repeatedly felt throughout the experience. Keats's poetry often incorporates an element of how life is a miserable matter, which roots itself to the poet's personal affairs. A prime example of Keats incorporating his Gothic theme is in The Eve of Saint Agnes. Here, one of the stanzas end with, "Save wings for heaven, Porphyra grew faint, she knelt, so pure thing, so free from mortal taint." The rhyming couplet is an implication that the creeping Porphyro and pure Madeline come together. This emphasizes the poet's undertone, is how the sacred is always being preyed on by ominous forces. For me, Keats has helped highlight a philosophy where as much as there is light in this world, equally there's just the same amount of darkness. It's this melancholic inevitability that I've tried to produce in my own writing. I am a firm believer how everyone is a collection of complicated layers, each with his own judgment of what morality may be. As I've grown older, Keats has influenced me to acknowledge that life is a compilation of various gray areas. Each person has their own perspective of a much broader narrative. This poet is the reason I attempt to create stories with multiple meanings and an underlying sub rosa motif. A writer's work is a response to their own life. Keats has the ability to root his poetry from his relationships, an admirable trait. This poet has influenced my own writing in a way where I can re-evaluate my relationships through non-rose tinted glasses. Although Keats's poetry is heavily grounded in love and passion, he can skillfully conjure rhymes which don't romanticize an otherwise tragic relationship. Often pieces of literature would portray romances from an idealistic and ideal viewpoints. Keats, on the other hand, actually explores the reality of romance and pinpoints the human condition. Personally, his poetry has influenced me because I began realizing the genuine nature of us humans and how romances are actually played out day to day. Through embracing the flaws of being human, that in of itself produces the true love and passion than most literature that offers an unattainable illusion. One of the most influential figures for Keats' inspiration was his neighbor, Frances Bonney. After the death of his brother, Keats eventually fell for the young girl, who was his source of solace. By 1819, the poet had gone into one of his most productive years. With Bronte as his muse, Keats came to write Eve of St. Agnes, Hyperion, and Bright Star. It has been quoted that Keats's infatuation would consume him. In turn, he was given new impetus, new inspiration, new insight into his own emotions and the world itself. His poetry began to reflect his new maturity and power. During his lifespan, Keats was viewed as a man who tackled taboo subjects and was met with scorn due to the lack of his literary qualifications. It is understandable why the poet had poor criticism while he was still alive. In 1818, Lockhart had commented on Endymion being imperturbable, drivelling idiocy. It was only after his death that the poet had gained respect. By 1882, another critic named Swinburne had remarked that Ode to Nightingale is one of the final masterpieces of human work in all of time and all for ages. My own creative process stems from having an overarching plotline based upon mythology or fantasy. I tend to write certain concepts as a mean of escapism or to make a bleak situation more appealing. It wasn't until I learned of Keats that I had decided to craft more personal works. While also having studied psychology, I soon understood that Keats writes from his subconscious and tunes in with his unspoken desires. In return, I began to acknowledge my own thoughts and emotions while channeling them to poetry. As Keats has written straight from his heart, I too wrote poetry as a means to convey intimate moments. In conclusion, John Keats is the man behind my inspiration because of how he tackles an overarching theme of humanity. I first came across him during my A-level literature studies, and he became my gateway to poetry. In the same vein Spencer first invoked Keats' love of poetry, Keats drew me in with his raw writing. There's a certain beauty in writing pieces that are so honest and exposed. Keats' charm comes from the matter that he didn't necessarily live the happiest of lives. Through some of the most horrendous periods he's had to suffer, Keats has produced epic poetry, which in itself is art I can admire. True to the model of his own lover's malady, Keats has undergone pain which is only best conveyed when you experience it yourself. He is the epitome of being human, being able to feel such passion while opening yourself up to more dangerous lessons.